Today's lecture will focus on the railroads and the building of mostly the transcontinental railroads. So the railroads are really important in the development of the country. That's why we have a whole slideshow and lecture on it. We've talked about it before as well. But in 1865, so during that Civil War time, there were about 35,000 miles of railroad total. And almost all of that was seen over east of the Mississippi River. Okay, so all of this area over here is where almost all of the railroad mileage was. However, by 1900, the railroads had expanded very, very rapidly, and there were about 200,000 miles of railroad running all the way from coast to coast. As you can see, I mean, you could take the railroad from San Francisco out to New York if you wanted to. So it'd be possible through all the connections and all that kind of stuff. And this really started in 1862. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act. And basically what it said is it said we have two companies that want to build this big railroad, this Transcontinental Railroad. So that means all the way across the entire continent. Okay, they want to build it. And these two companies are the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Okay, so Union Pacific Railroad, Central Pacific Railroad, they connect to make the Transcontinental Railroad, as we call it. So you can kind of see here, that's the Central Pacific, and here's the Union Pacific, and they met here in the middle. Okay, and so the other thing that this did, and really pretty importantly, is this act offered them to be able to keep the land that was right by the railroad track. So in the right-of-way of the railroad track, they let the railroads have that land. And so what the railroads were able to do was sell that to settlers and sell that to other people and prospectors and all that kind of stuff, and make enough money to pay this huge expense that was involved in creating the railroad and building the railroad up. So the first railroad that we're going to talk about, or the first part of it, is the Union Pacific. This is the railroad that started in Omaha, Nebraska, okay, and moved west. So it started in the middle of the country and moved to the west, and it was under the direction of this man. This is Granville Dodge. Okay, Granville Dodge was a former Union general in the Civil War, and he was an engineer on the railroad. He was the one that kind of kept the project going and knew the plans and had created those and all that kind of stuff. So he'd be the man to go to. He's the boss, the man to go to when something bad came up. And he would make those kinds of decisions. But it wasn't easy. Building the railroad wasn't easy. It was hard work. And really, when you think about it, you were out in the frontier. You're out there in the middle of nowhere. There's no stores around to do anything. There's no police to protect you or military around. Okay, it was really, really a difficult place to live, because anything that made life hard, you were pretty much fully exposed to, and you had to deal with it yourself. So all of these difficulties, like blizzards in the mountains, so as you're going up in the mountains, you've got snow and wind and all that kind of stuff that could easily freeze you and injure you or kill you. The heat in the desert, so you're talking the same people are dealing with these blizzards as they are dealing with this intense heat as they're moving across the desert. Also dealing with angry Native Americans. These Native Americans were mad because we weren't supposed to take that land, and these people had, I mean, the government had agreed that if you let us pass through, then we won't ever take this land, it's yours. And they had just given this land to the railroads, and the railroads were selling it off, and the railroads were getting in the way of the migration patterns of the buffalo. And the buffalo were very, very important to those natives, as we learned before. And so that was a big problem. The railroad was killing off many of these buffalo to feed their men and to get them out of the way of the railroad. They needed them not coming across it and messing it up and whatever else. Okay, so that created anger amongst the Native Americans, threatening their way of life, and sometimes there would be raids or attacks or things like that. The other thing that happened, or that was kind of an issue, was these just like regular workplace issues. So labor, were there enough workers to do what you needed to do? Were they willing to do what you needed to do? Could you raise and keep enough money to pay those workers as well as to buy the supplies that you needed to push on, and then the engineering of it, the actual planning. Any problems that came up, you had to have qualified, intelligent people to be able to fix that. So if you came across a canyon or a river or something like that, you had to have the qualified professionals that could create a bridge that would hold not just people, but these huge trains that were already very heavy and loaded up with lots of stuff to carry out to the west. The workers, the Union Pacific Railroad ended up employing about 10,000 workers, and they were all kinds of different people. There were a lot of Irish immigrants that came in, and so kind of the Irish mostly built the railroad, but there were immigrants from all over Europe. There were Civil War veterans who had fought and really didn't have any other skills to be able to do anything, so they came out to work in this unskilled labor area. There were miners that had been frustrated because they couldn't find anything. There were farmers who were not able to grow anything, and they had to join the railroad. Cooks, adventurers, ex-convicts, even people that had been in jail and couldn't find a job around their house because of their reputation. Now they moved out and worked on the railroad. All right, the other side is the Central Pacific Railroad, and if you remember from that map on the second slide, it was shorter than the other railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad started in California, which was pretty rural. It wasn't the space where all of the factories and industry and all that kind of stuff were. So it was kind of difficult to get, a little more difficult to get the supplies there. The Central Pacific Railroad was thought up as by an engineer named Theodore Judah, but he didn't have the money, so he sold stock in his company, to 4 different random merchants in Sacramento, in California. Their names we call them the Big Four here. That's Leland Stanford, Charlie Crocker, Mark Hopkins, and Collins P. Huntington. All of these men became very rich from the Central Pacific Railroad. Leland Stanford is the one that you probably have heard of. He became the governor of California soon later, served as a U.S. senator, and eventually would go on to find a university in California that you've heard of, Stanford University, named after himself. One of the difficulties with working out of a rural area was it was hard to find workers. So they couldn't find enough workers to do the work and make the railroad progress like they wanted to. And so they had to hire some immigrants to come over and help to build the railroad. About 10,000 different immigrants came in from China, and they were paid about $1 per day. So they weren't paid very much, and they had very, very dangerous work. It was maybe even more dangerous than the work done by the Union Pacific Railroad, because instead of being out over the plains most of the time, they were trying to go through the mountains. And so they would have to go through and dig tunnels through these rock mountains, and using dynamite and different things like that. And so it was very rugged terrain out there, and so these Chinese immigrants did a lot of work. The equipment, like I said before, had to come from the east. It had to come from where the factories were, so places like New York and Boston and the eastern coast. But the problem is you don't have the ability to ship all of this stuff out across the land and drive it over there in like a semi-truck or a train. A train didn't even exist that got out there, so they had to find a way to get the goods to California. And so there were essentially 2 different options. They could either ship it and put it on a ship, put it on an actual water ship, and go all the way around the bottom of South America, because there's no break in the land. So you had to go all the way around, which would take months to get from New York to California. Or they could ship it and then move it across the Isthmus of Panama. So it's just like a narrow piece of land in Panama, move it across the land there, and then put it on another ship and take it back up to California, which would be a little bit faster, but again, a much more intense process, and one that took a whole lot more labor. Take a moment to write out your answer for checkpoint number 1. So the Transcontinental Railroad in total was the combination of that Union Pacific that we talked about and the Central Pacific that we talked about, okay? And just some statistics about it to show you kind of how big of an undertaking it was. It really only took about 4 years to complete, which was great. And so it was done relatively quickly. But when you think about the amount of work that went into it, it's amazing. 1 single mile of track included 400 rails. So you can see these metal parts, right, are the rails. Okay, and then 4,000 spikes in each one, because you would have to pound each rail into each. These wooden parts are called railroad ties. They keep them together at a specific distance from each other. So 400 rails, 4,000 spikes had to be pounded in, and that's just for 1 mile. We're talking a over 1,700 mile railroad that was built. So that's an astounding number of rails and spikes. So with the final numbers, the Central Pacific, like I said, had a rougher terrain. They had a more difficult time getting supplies. And so their part of the railroad was only about 688 miles, but again, through mountains, through really difficult land. Whereas the Union Pacific was able to move a little faster over the plains and got about 1,086 miles complete. Where the two finally met was Promontory Point, Utah, and some of the more fancy important people, these people that, not the workers who were actually important, but these people that had gotten the money, like Leland Stanford and some of these other ones, were honored to drive in silver and gold spikes into the railroad to kind of commemorate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. As soon as Leland Stanford hammered in the very last spike, the telegraph operators sent the news across the nation. Everybody in the country knew that it was complete very quickly, and people celebrated all around the country. In New York, there were cannons going off to celebrate it. In Chicago, they had a parade. And in Philadelphia, the citizens actually rang the Liberty Bell itself to commemorate this, to celebrate that this had been completed, and now the country was connected from the western area all the way to the east. So the railroads really built the country at this time up a lot, and so as more railroads were being built, there was just more growth around the country. It helped the economy a ton for a couple of different reasons. It brought up the amount of people that would be buying a bunch of the different products, so you can now sell to people all the way across the country, as instead of just being stuck in your own little area or even previous railroad area of the east. So another half of the country was opened up with people that could buy a lot of your products. Also, the railroad itself spent a lot of money. They spent a lot of money on steel for the rails and for the spikes, and then coal to run their trains and run their machines and things like that, wood to make the ties, and other materials that they needed just to kind of keep themselves alive. And so the amount of money that spent helped a lot of people to have jobs, right, that were building these rails and building other things like that. The other thing that happened is integration started to happen, and what basically happened is these large railroad companies were able to buy up and bring together a bunch of different small, not connected railroad companies and connect them into this web across the country. And so now you have this big system where you can get from anywhere to anywhere, basically. And so it really allowed or made it easier to move stuff, as well as easier to get from one place to another. It helped out industry in the South a lot, because there wasn't that much. We talked about how there wasn't that much railroad before this, and these integrated systems now could bring anyone from across the country down into the South, or products from the South into everywhere across the country. And so what that did is it kind of started up some new industries. Florida still to this day is a big tourist state, and kind of the Florida tourism industry started at that point. People wanted to go down and enjoy the weather and enjoy the scenery and all that kind of stuff, so they would go down there for vacations. Thirdly, the efficiency made by it, so being able to move lots and lots of stuff very quickly, much more quickly than we ever could before, ended up bringing down shipping prices, cutting them by half. So they went down a full 50 cents or 50%, sorry, or over 50% actually, between 1860 and 1900. The last thing that it did is it brought all of our clocks together. This is the reason we have time zones, okay? So we made 4 time zones in America, and what that did is that synchronized the clock. So a time zone is just the region that all has the same standard time, right? And so what you do is you'd have these 4 standard time zones across America, and that would allow people to know when the train was coming through, which would help people's safety, as well as help the scheduling of the trains and all that kind of stuff. And so, like I said, it was in 1883, it was the American Railway Association that created the 4 time zones in America. And these railroad men, these investors got really, really rich off of the railroads because they were given these land grants, which is a land grant, it's just land given by the federal government that you can do whatever you want with. The companies would take this land right next to the railroad and they would sell it. They would sell it off to people that wanted to live there, settlers and prospectors of people. You know, a prospector would be someone who bought the land thinking, oh, someone's going to want that eventually, and I can charge higher price for it. And so they would make that money, and a lot of them got very, very rich. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, these are 2 men that got very, very rich. And when that happened, people started to accuse them of swindling investors. So basically cheating investors and taking a lot of the money for themselves instead of actually putting the money into the railroad and, you know, truly giving out the profits in a fair manner. And then also they were accused of bribing officials, bribing the government. And yeah, bribes did happen. They did happen because the government was the one who was giving the funding. The government was the one who was giving the land to these people and to these railroad companies. And so if you were able to get in there and somebody was a little bit shady in Congress and you could bribe them to give you more land grants than some other railroad investor, then you would be the bigger railroad and you would get the money. And so if you would do higher bribes, you had a lot more to gain because you would get more land grants than somebody else who wasn't bribing them, who was honest. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 2. So the corruption was seen and made public in about 1872 when with the Credit Mobilier scandal. The Credit Mobilier was a construction company. It was it was created by some of the investors in the Union Pacific Railroad. One of them was Oak Ames, who was also a senator, and so he should have been above this, but he wasn't. Many of Senate members were in here. And so what was happening is the Union Pacific and the Credit Mobilier would sell each other contracts. So the Credit Mobilier would say, okay, I will build this for you, but they would charge way too much for it. And so they would go in and build it, and then the investors of the Credit Mobilier would pocket that money. The Union Pacific was fine with it. They paid these bills, but it was to the point where they were mostly bankrupt when the Union Pacific was completed. And so to get more land grants, Oak Ames and some others sold these cheap shares of the Union Pacific and Credit Mobilier sold cheap shares of it to the members of Congress so that they could get more land grants. So kind of like a bribe, I'll give you this for really cheap, and now you're invested in it too. So now all of us who are part of this, profit sharing group will obviously want this group to have more land so that we can make more money. All right, and so this is pretty shady stuff. They're kind of essentially laundering money. They're stealing it from all of the investors of the Union Pacific and funneling it into just these particular investors. And a lot of them happen to be government members. A newspaper article came out, listed the members who had bought the shares and everything. This led to a big investigation around the election of 1872. Big investigation. A lot of people were implicated, a bunch of politicians, including Representative James A. Garfield. He'd later become president, and the actual vice president of America at that time was also involved in it. Nobody got any criminal charges, so that means no jail time, no civil charges, no fines, no having to pay money, or ever brought out of it. But it kind of gave a negative view of those people. And yeah, that's kind of why we see them as a little bit shady. Not all of the railroads were negative. One of the railroads that was absolutely not negative was the Great Northern Railroad. And the Great Northern Railroad was built from the Wisconsin area, okay, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all the way out to Washington State. This was built by James J. Hill, and James J. Hill built this with his own money. He did not get any federal land grants, no federal subsidies. He didn't have any help from the government at all. But what he did is he figured out goods that were in demand in China. So what his railroad could do is they could ship these goods from the middle of the country or from Chicago or wherever all the way out to Washington to be delivered to Asia. And so now it opened up this whole market. And so he was able to put a bunch of goods on his ships here, or on his trains here, move them out this way, okay, and then his trains would be full going that way. And so then he would unload them, put everything on here, and send it off to Asia. But then also, when his trains came back, they would fill it up with the resources from the west that were needed in the east in the factories, and carry it back along the same route. So both directions, when it was going west, his trains were full. When it was going east, his trains were full. And so as opposed to other railroads that would send empty trains out to the west, and then when they came back, they would come back full of resources. So this was the most successful of the transcontinental railroads, and one of the only ones that was never forced into bankruptcy. You can still get on and use the Great Northern Railway even today. Please write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.